I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. At the end of December, publisher Merriam-Webster released its list of top 10 words of the year for 2010. Austerity was at the top. The company made its list based on how often people looked up definitions using its online dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines austerity as enforced or extreme economy. Greece and Ireland face huge budget deficits. This has forced severe spending cuts for those governments. And they are not alone. When nations get into financial trouble, they may request loans from the International Monetary Fund or other donors. Donors, however, demand austerity measures, such as sharp cuts in government spending and tax increases. Michael Izza is chief executive of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. He says the world financial crisis pushed some governments to spend more. But not all debt problems are the same. Economist Dev Carr says Greece got into trouble by having too many government employees spending freely on retirement pay and misleading investors. Last spring, Greece received rescue loans of over $100 billion. But Germany agreed to help only if Greece promised tough austerity measures. Ireland's budget deficits grew sharply after it guaranteed the bad loans of the country's biggest banks. In November, European officials agreed to a bailout nearly as large as the one Greece received. But austerity measures are unpopular. Large protests have taken place not only in Greece and Ireland, but also in Britain, Portugal, and Romania. Other nations facing big deficits and slow economic growth are also seeing their borrowing costs rise. Credit rating agencies are warning about the debts of Portugal and Spain, and others may follow. In May, European leaders agreed to set aside nearly $700 billion to help troubled countries in the area. But the chief of the International Monetary Fund, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, says a more organized approach is needed. He said, Europe has to provide a comprehensive solution to this problem. The piecemeal approach, one country after the other one, is not a good one. This could mean austerity will remain a top word for 2011. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find more economics reports at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, welcome to Economic News in Special English. Economic growth in East Asia and the Pacific region is expected to reach 7.9% this year. That is higher than in any other part of the world. But that is only part of the story. The other side of East Asia's success includes conflicting territorial claims in the area and trade imbalances with the rest of the world. Competition for natural resources is an increasingly important issue. This has led to territorial disputes. For example, the islands known as Diaoyu in China and Senkaku in Japan are thought to be rich in oil. Areas around the islands are said to be good fishing grounds. China and Japan have competing claims for the territory. Kenneth Lieberthal is an Asia expert with the Brookings Institution here in Washington. He says he has not seen evidence that either China or Japan is willing to reduce tensions over the islands. That means territorial disputes will likely continue. China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines are involved in territorial claims with neighbors over West Pacific islands. Trade imbalances are another issue. East Asia has long been a source of exports. China's big trade imbalance with the United States has concerned U.S. lawmakers for years. Some blame China's control of its currency for America's big trade deficit, but Kenneth Lieberthal does not think so. He notes other policies. One is China's direct support for many of its important industries with government aid or subsidies. Mr. Lieberthal says Chinese rules at home also hurt countries seeking to export to China. He says these and other issues, such as the abuse of intellectual property rights, have a much bigger effect on America's trade deficit with China. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Economic concerns have been at the heart of the recent protests in Brazil. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff answered growing public unrest over government spending and economic concerns. On June 24th, she proposed a popular vote or plebiscite on a constitutional process to make reforms needed by the country. President Rousseff also described a $23 billion spending plan. The money would go to public transportation and would support investment in education and health care. The Brazilian leader also promised to fight political corruption. President Rousseff met with state governors, city mayors, and protest leaders in the capital, Brasilia. It is estimated that 1 million people took part in protests across Brazil. Demonstrators are angry that the government is spending billions of dollars in public money in preparations for two huge sporting events. Brazil will hold the FIFA World Cup Soccer Championship next year, and then the 2016 Olympic Games 2 years later. The protests started when the government announced it would increase transportation costs, such as bus and subway fares. But the protests soon turned to other economic issues and spread. As a result, the government suspended its plans for the transportation fare increases. Demonstrators have been demanding better health care, education, and public transportation, and action against corruption. As Brazil prepares for the major sporting events, the country is also facing rising inflation. The inflation rate is now over 6%, which is higher than the government's target. For VOA Learning English, I'm Mario Ritter.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. Burma's financial industry has suffered from years of mismanagement under military rule. But more recently, the government has pushed through economic reforms. Those measures are changing the nation's banks and re-energizing businesses. There are even hopes that Burma could become one of Asia's fastest growing economies, an Asian tiger. Burma had one of the best performing economies in Southeast Asia before the military seized power in 1962. Many years of state control over the economy followed. Widespread corruption and international sanctions left it one of the poorest countries in the area. Economist Sean Turnell says turning around the economy will require strong measures against corruption. That is why he says political change is important to economic reform. He says restrictive measures make it harder for Burmese to do business internationally. The restrictions on foreign monetary exchange do not only hurt big business, they hurt small businesses too. Here is an example. Nini owns a workshop in Rangoon. He and his family manufacture toys for buyers from all over the world. His toy business is international, but Burma's banks are not. Nini still depends on middlemen called hundis to process foreign money transactions. Foreign visitors to Burma once used black market money changers, and hundis are still the main method for international monetary transfers. But the government hopes this unsupervised cash-based economy is ending. It plans to do this with new ATMs or automated teller machines and foreign exchange licenses for private banks. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Last week, we reported that international economists released a hopeful report about Africa's economy. The African Development Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and the OECD Development Center wrote the report. It predicts economic growth on the continent could reach 5 or 6% over the next 2 years. Economists expect 7% growth in West Africa's economy in the next 2 years. They say oil continues to be a major source of income, but that other industries are also important. Growth in Nigeria is coming from agriculture, trade and information, and communications technology. Manufacturing is helping Ghana grow. Sierra Leone is the fastest growing country in the area because of its iron ore exports, as well as its agriculture and building industries. In southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia are expected to grow between 5 and 7%. Labor problems and weak foreign export markets have affected growth in South Africa. But that country is still expected to grow almost 3% over the next 2 years. Angela Lusigi is an economist and policy advisor for the Regional Bureau for Africa in the UN Development Program. She says many countries are working to balance their budgets, and they have solid financial policies. She says the next question is how to make those improved policies result in growth that helps all of a country's citizens. She says inequality remains a big problem in Africa. Ms. Lusigi says it is important to have growth that affects all people and not just one group. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Officials in Washington recently lost a ruling over their power to enforce competition on the Internet. Now the Federal Communications Commission has a new plan. The FCC currently defines high-speed Internet as an information service. As such, its powers to set rules for broadband service have never been clearly recognized. But telephone service is a recognized area for the agency to regulate. So the FCC proposes to redefine broadband as a telecommunications service. Congress could give the agency clearer powers over broadband. But FCC Chairman Julius Genachowski calls his plan a third way. He says the Commission would act narrowly and enforce only parts of existing law. He says the government is not regulating the Internet. The changes are meant to support net neutrality, the idea that all web traffic should be treated equally. The ruling by a federal appeals court in April involved Internet service provider Comcast. The judges ruled that the FCC had no legal basis for an effort to keep Comcast from limiting access to some services over its network. The company said file-sharing users were slowing its traffic. Broadband providers say regulating them would hurt investment. Verizon Communications called the chairman's plan legally unsupported. As it happens, the plan was announced on May 6th, the same day as the flash crash on American stock markets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average briefly suffered a severe drop. On May 18th, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced new circuit breakers to support orderly trading. The plan involves the Standard & Poor's list of 500 stocks. Stock exchanges have agreed to temporarily halt trading of any stock that rises or falls 10% or more within 5 minutes. The rules will be re-examined in 6 months and could be expanded. And in another development, the Senate voted on May 20th to permit final debate and a vote on a financial reform bill. The House of Representatives has passed its own bill already. The House and Senate versions will need to be combined into final legislation for President Obama to sign into law. The proposed changes in financial rules are the most extensive since the 1930s. The President says the aim is not to punish banks, but to protect the larger economy and the American people. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Egypt is the biggest of the nations hit by recent protests in North Africa and the Middle East. One of the causes of this spreading wave of popular dissatisfaction is a lack of economic progress. Egypt is not a major oil exporter. Its economy is not big enough to affect world economic growth. But important pipelines cross Egypt, and Egypt controls the Suez Canal. About 8% of world shipping passes through this link between Europe and Asia. That includes 2 million barrels of oil each day, mainly to Europe. Many experts say they expect the canal to remain open. Still, concerns about the Suez have pushed oil prices to their highest levels since 2008. Fariborz Gadar heads the Center for Global Business Studies at Penn State University. He says poverty in Egypt remains high, up to 40% in some areas. Yet Egypt is not alone. Foreign investors worry about corruption, mismanagement, and security problems across North Africa and the Middle East. Every year, millions of young people enter the job market. Populations are young and growing fast. In Egypt, the economy grew about 5% last year, too little growth to create enough jobs. Fariborz Gadar says the United States in a good year creates fewer than 2 million jobs. He says Europe and the U.S. together generate 3 million jobs. Middle Eastern countries have to generate up to 8 million jobs just to keep their youth employed. Fariborz Gadar says protests could spread to bigger economies. He says the mismanagement of the Iranian economy could cause protests by the Iranian population because food prices and inflation are increasing. In recent years, the World Bank has praised Egypt for cutting barriers to trade. But economist Deborah Hewitt at the College of William and Mary in Virginia says private foreign investment remains weak. She says those investments have grown quickly from almost nothing 8 years ago. But they are still not enough to lift the economy. Professor Hewitt says Egypt could look to reforms in Morocco that have appealed to investors. Morocco has strengthened its education system and invested in roads, ports, and electric power. She says investments like these not only put people to work, they also create the basis for future economic and political development. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal.